Hello and welcome to all of you to this panel organized by the Foreign Affairs Association of students here in Lund, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at the university, and the European Iran Research Network group, who has brought together some people here to discuss what's going on in Iran, and more importantly, what's happening with the nuclear negotiations and how that affects the region, and therefore, by definition, if you will, the world. We have a very distinguished panel that I'm very happy to see here in Lund. We have Ambassador Roberto Toscano from Italy, who has been ambassador to Iran and Moscow and New Delhi. We have Ambassador Peter Taylor, who is the present Swedish ambassador to Iran, has also been ambassador to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and headed the office in Stockholm on Middle East at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. To my extreme right, I have Dina Esfandiari, who is a fellow at King's College, formerly working at IISS in London. And next to me is Ariane Tabatabai, who has just finished her PhD at King's and is now working at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. So we will be discussing a whole range of issues related to the nuclear negotiations, but we will begin with history, obviously, and ask Roberto to tell us something about his experience as an ambassador in Iran in the end of the 90s and the early 2000s.
Well, yes. He asked me to say that in 7 minutes, so I will try. Yes, I arrived in Iran in 2003, stayed until 2008. And I arrived there also with a certain experience because it was almost at the end of my career. But I finished on a high note, I think. As a matter of fact, although I had done some reading on Iran, nothing had prepared me for what I actually saw. You know, this happens to everybody who goes to Iran. Although they are well informed and even, you know, just curious, but the image of the country that everybody has before going there has nothing in common with the image of the country when somebody leaves it, also for tourists, and even more for somebody who stays there for 5 years. To an extent that I have to be kind of self-restrained. Otherwise, everybody will think that I went native, which for a diplomat is the biggest sin of them all. What did I see in those years? Mind me, 2003, 2008. It was a change a switch between Khatami, reformist, and Ahmadinejad. This was extremely interesting because it helped me understand also the nature of the regime. You know, there are, of course, how do you define the regime? Well, somebody has very clear ideas about that. A certain gentleman thought that Iran is a messianic apocalyptic cult. Of course, I'm talking about Benjamin Netanyahu. If you think that, then you close the book. It's you know enough, right? It's just a kind of monster that you have to be very wary about. Well, that is not true. Iran is an incredibly complex system. Is it a dictatorship? Yes and no, because it's more like an oligarchy. Is it a theocracy? Yes and no, because although Iranians are by and large religious, they have become anti-clerical. So how can you have an anti-clerical theocracy? That doesn't work. So again, it's a country of different nuances, but it's very difficult to talk nuance when you have the image that is so controversial and so antagonistic. And in a way, it's the regime itself that wants to show itself as being antagonistic because that's their identity. I'm talking about the hardcore of the conservative part of the regime. Lately, we've seen something different, but we'll talk about it, of course. So I saw the change between the Khatami government and the Ahmadinejad government. Was it a substantial change? yes and no. What definitely happened, and here I have a quote by an Iranian political scientist, which really spells out one very interesting part. I will read it. Populism in Iran, parenthesis, Ahmadinejad was not a revival of Khomeini. He was more like, Chavez. Okay, Chavez. Populism in Iran has brought to power a large number of natives with unassuming backgrounds equipped with peasant cunning who have been given university degrees despite particularly sparse schooling. So this was a change. And it is so true that the people I related with as an ambassador, in ministries, at the top of the system, when Ahmadinejad came in, were shunted off to parking lots or went abroad, or because they were no longer useful. And when Rouhani was elected, and I heard that a lot of those people came back, I understood that Rouhani was a serious thing, because people are important. But as I said, the regime, as such, did not change that much. Paradoxically, even as far as relations with the outside world are concerned, Ahmadinejad shared what is the goal of most Iranians, including Iranians within the regime, ending the isolation of the country. But he went about it in a most counterproductive way, with rhetoric, talking about, Holocaust denial. So, it was not very intelligent on his part to pursue those goals with exactly the opposite rhetoric. But anyway, fortunately, he's no longer around, although there are times when people are saying that he wants to come back politically. I don't think he has much of a chance, fortunately. Now, I said, is it a democracy or a dictatorship? Of course it's not a democracy. And yet, if you look at the system, at the constitution, it's an Islamic republic. And through the years, you see the republic element going up or down. The Islamic, it's a sort of tension between the two. Right now, somebody is trying to stress the republic dimension. Republic doesn't necessarily mean democratic. A republic means, what's called a rule of law. And as you know, rule of law is not necessarily democratic. It can be oligarchic also. Again, it's an oligarchy. Although there is a supreme leader, there is real politics in Iran, and there are people who win and people who lose. And the next day, they switch sides. To give an example, and then I'll finish, otherwise the chairman will say something nasty. Khomeini was the revolutionary, the founding father. He was like Vladimir Lenin, But then, the system which wants to survive decided that what was necessary was a modern, so-called normal functioning state. And there was that stage, Rafsanjani. And then the system understood that there was the need for some letting up of some controlled reform. And Khatami was allowed to do that. But then, when things went too far, the supreme leader, who's has the steering wheel, stopped the reform and invented Ahmadinejad, who was totally invented. I always like to say it's like the priest has an altar boy, but the altar boy at a certain point started behaving like the priest, and the priest stopped him. The latter part of Ahmadinejad's government, he was frozen. He couldn't do anything. Now we have another experiment, which is basically a centrist experiment. But mind me, the present government is a coalition government, because a lot of reformists are joined with the centrists to see whether this isolation of the country can be broken and whether there is a path to modernization. Of course, it's a big bet. Some people think that modernization will lead to an evolution also in democratic terms. But some people think that modernization and the breaking of the isolation will strengthen the regime. We don't know. And the supreme leader is as afraid of ending like, in a confrontation with the West, Saddam, but he's also afraid of the regime ending as the Soviet regime ended, because reform led to the demise of the system. The jury is still out.
Thank you very much. So we turn to Peter, who is there now.
Thank you. That's why I will just make one comment. Now they don't speak about an Islamic republic, they are speaking about an Islamic democracy, which is a really important thing. I think a few things, and just follow what you said. What I also have, in order to understand Iran, if we at all can, is to realize it's a very complex society. It's a very complex governance system. It's a very complex power system. It's also a system where you have divided mandates. The president, who we been speaking about what he's doing, he doesn't have a mandate like a prime minister. He has a limited mandate. His obvious mandate is economy, for example. His obvious, not so obvious mandate is security. He is not responsible for security. There are these very complex systems which we are trying to understand. I think we can also admit that we don't always understand, because there are forces which are not open to discuss with us, and we don't know. But it's important to understand there are lots of power centers. This is not a monopoly system where all powers goes even from the supreme leader. The supreme leader needs himself to navigate in a complex water. He is not the founding father, which is a big difference. The authority of Khomeini, he does not have. It's also, I think, is important to understand the society, which is very, very different. The leadership is in principle the same who did the revolution in 79-80. It's still the governing elite, which is often used. It's a structure that did the revolution, including the president. Rouhani was a part of the revolution. But you have a society which is simply consists of the children of the revolution. 70% of the population is under 35, i.e. they were born after the revolution. It's I think and colleagues will speak about the negotiations. So I would just say that the expectations among the 70% and the new generation of what will happen if there is a nuclear agreement will be a big challenge for the leadership. I tried to interview lots of young people living there. One or two things one should keep in mind. One is a very strong patriotic feeling of Iran. You may or may not like the system. You don't identify yourself with the revolution. You more identify yourself with the war between Iran and Iraq. That is, for me, one of the striking things. That is, for someone who's 23, that is very much a defining moment, not so much the revolution. It's also a society where these expectations we have had a long period of bad economic development. You blame everything on the sanctions. That's it, just to make it too easy. If there is a agreement over the sanctions, we know that there will be need to take a look at reforming of the economy. There again, you have different interests in this complex power structures. They're not only political power structures, they're also economic power structures which form a part of the political setup. And there is another interesting aspect. As far as I know, no country in the world has the same brain drain as Iran. Will it be possible to get all these clever Iranians back? I don't know. The history tells us if you are away in the diaspora, you don't necessarily come back. But there is a brain drain, which will be an impediment, I would argue, for economic development. I think there's also, as you are saying, it's also a very traditional society. Regardless if you are very religious or not, it is a very, very traditional, I even would say conservative society. How that will work out will be interesting when changes will have to happen. To what extent will a young generation accept not being hooked up to internet on the same speed that you are? It's just a small little issue, but it comes back. And it's important to understand, I came to Iran first time 1992. I've then been dealing much more with Central Eastern Europe in the bad old days. It's important to understand that Iranians travel. Iranians are well informed about what happens outside of the country, and I'm quite convinced that will also translate into these expectations. If there is now this opening, which you spoke about, what will be the openings on the other side? So for me, this is a big challenge. But I know that one of the colleagues will speak on the regional impact. My point would be, as an example of a rather traditional society, is that this government pursues a very traditional Iranian policy, which was defined before the revolution. As another example of a society which has a very long-term perspective. You had, during the first years of the revolution, it was a big mess. It's not a big mess anymore. The same thing. It's also, it has to define, Iran has to define its role in the region, not only politically, but also economically, as it had to do also before 1979. I stop there so the chairman will not look evilly at me.
I wonder where my reputation comes from. So we now have a bit of a backdrop for what's going on in Iran as a society and how it has developed in the last couple of decades. We will return and revisit these issues, but now we want to turn to Ariane to help us understand the nuclear negotiations themselves.
Yeah, so one thing that has been stressed is that the nuclear negotiations are going to be a key for what happens next in Iran. And what I want to focus on in the next 7 minutes, before I get the evil eye as well, is 4 major points that come across from the agreement that was announced earlier last month, in Lausanne. And these are 4 technical points that I believe make this agreement a good one for both sides. The first point is monitoring and verification. That is a point that hasn't been stressed as much in the literature by analysts in recent months because everybody has been focusing on quantifiables, quote unquote, meaning how many centrifuges will Iran have, how many years will the deal be implemented for. But there hasn't been as much attention to the monitoring, which I think is actually perhaps the biggest achievement of this agreement so far. And if and when we have a deal in June, or July, this will be a major component of it. The monitoring part of this agreement will extend beyond the duration of the implementation of the deal. The agreement so far highlights that what is going to happen is going to be 10 to 15-year limitation of Iran's nuclear status to some level on some activities, and I will talk about those a bit more in detail. But the monitoring part is going to be continued for about 25 years, and in some cases, Iran will actually continue to implement some of the aspects of it forever, if it agrees to do so. So, for instance, one of the important things is that Iran is going to be granting more access to its sites. Another thing is that it's going to implement what is known as Code 3.1, essentially granting, telling the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, very quickly earlier when it's going to start planning new facilities. It is also going to be, the Iranians say, quote unquote, voluntarily implementing the additional protocol, which gives enhanced access, again, to the IAEA, to its facilities. The second component after monitoring and verification is going to be, Iran is going to continue its research and development, and it's going to continue procuring nuclear technology for its nuclear energy program. Now, one of the things that has been introduced in this agreement, and I think is fairly important, especially for the Iranians, is this procurement network that will be granted to Iran, which means that Iran won't have to go to the black market anymore to get pieces and equipment for its nuclear program. Instead, it will have a procurement network that will be monitored, that will be verified, that will allow it to have to continue growing its nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, and will allow the international community to see what's going on there. The third and fourth points go hand in hand, and that has to do with the two paths to the bomb, which essentially means enrichment and reprocessing highly enriched uranium or plutonium. On the plutonium side, the heavy water reactor in Iraq has been a center of attention for the past few years. And what is going to happen is that there's going to be a redesign, which means that there's going to be less production of plutonium, but as the Iranians want it, it's not going to be converted into a light water reactor. What Iran is also going to do is to reiterate and make it official something that it's been saying for a while, which is that it won't be taking on any reprocessing activities, which essentially means that the plutonium won't be used for a bomb. And this will be for 15 years. It's also saying that it's not going to be building any more heavy water reactors. It will build light water reactors instead. This, I think, is also a major achievement, especially given how much difficult this technical aspect was and how much back and forth there was in the initial stages of the negotiations. Lastly, the uranium path. So all of Iran's enrichment activities are now going to be centered in one site that is going to be inspected by the IAEA. And that is going to be the site at Natanz, which many of you have heard about. That's where Iran is going to be operating just a bit over 5,000 IR-1s, that is first-generation centrifuges, that are not as efficient, but it will do that for 10 years, which means that it will continue its enrichment activities. And it's going to keep Fordo, the very controversial site that was not declared by Iran initially, that was revealed by an opposition group, a dissident group, I guess, and in 2009, before it was eventually declared by Iran, and that is based on an IRGC site, which makes it even more controversial, and that is buried deep underground, which makes it very difficult to get to. The only country that can actually penetrate that is the United States with its bunker buster bombs. So there was a lot of controversy around this site, and many people wanted it shut. The EU and the US initially said, look, you need to shut down this site, we don't want it. Israel still sort of maintains that position to a large extent, and so do hardliners in the US. But essentially, the site is going to be kept open, but it's not going to be enriching uranium. It's going to be used for research and development purposes, and it's going to be producing stable isotopes. So again, Iran will continue to work on its program, that it will continue to use it for medical and industrial purposes, but it won't be, it will give an additional level of certainty to the international community that what it's doing is merely going to be for peaceful purposes rather than sort of dashing toward the bomb. So with all of this, essentially, Iran will have a 1-year breakout time, quote unquote, more or less. Again, this is something that has been an area of controversy for a lot of people. 1 year is not enough. That's certainly, I live in DC, as Roosevelt was saying, that's something that has been on the table a lot. People are saying, 1 year is not enough, we need 2 years. And actually, this is something that has kept, people keep pushing back. Initially, a lot of people started saying 6 months is a good breakout time. And then it was 1 year. And then when we got to 1 year, people are saying, no, this is still not enough. We need a year and a half or 2 years. So it's not very clear, it's not very concise, and a lot of it is essentially a fruit of domestic politics at this point in the United States, especially, but also in Iran, as has been mentioned. So I'll stop here, and we can go back to that.
So just to clarify, the bottom line is basically that Iran has agreed to curtail its program,
Yep.
And to do that both on the research side, but also in terms of the number of centrifuges. And the breakout time for those who are not into this nerdy game that the rest of us are, is basically the time it will take to enrich enough uranium for one bomb, to weapons grade, basically. And there is a lot to be said about that, but we can get back to that if anyone is interested in the technical details. But the bottom line then again is that Iran is agreeing to putting these curtailments on its program in exchange for a lifting of sanctions of different kinds. So what they're negotiating about right now is how to do this step by step, the art of the sequencing, so that both sides get what they want. We'll get back to that. Thank you. Now, if this happens, and this is the point here, that this is a deal that is not done yet, we are halfway. And already now, before we have a signed deal, a proper deal, we see how different countries in the region are reacting to the prospect of Iran coming in from the cold, as it were. So I turn to Dina to explain the reactions from Saudi Arabia and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. I think I'll begin by saying that it's been so long that anyone has achieved any major diplomatic success in the Middle East that everyone's forgotten what success looks like. In this case, success actually looks like each side leaving the table with way less than what they had in mind. And the Iranian nuclear deal, not only will it do just that, but as a result, it means that it's the best result that anybody in the Middle East could have actually hoped for at this stage. So what are the Gulf states actually worried about? Firstly, in terms of their safety, they're afraid that a deal wouldn't meet the minimum requirements they have in order to feel safe. Firstly, that means that they want the deal to be verifiable, but a lot of what they're hoping for is stuff that Iran would never have given up in the first place. And in terms of making the deal verifiable, Ariane's explained that actually what they've announced so far has gone a long way towards addressing this very problem. Secondly, they're afraid that as a result of the deal, some of the sanctions relief that Iran will get will enable it to use the money that it will get back in order to fund a lot of their disruptive activities in the region, which means, you know, funding regional proxies or potentially even further terrorist activities. The Gulf is also worried. In fact, I would say this is one of their biggest worries, is the worry of being sold out. What does that mean? That means that if the US and Iran get to an agreement, it'll remove one of the major impediments to the potential to build a relationship between the US and Iran. Now, I'm being very careful about that because I think we're still a long way away from that, but there is still potential. And so the Gulf states are worried, what if Iran and the US become too good a friend? And what if Gulf security is then ignored? Or worse, the Gulf states would have to accept Iranian dominance in the region or influence on the region. I mean, that really is their worst case scenario, and they really do believe that a deal will lead to that. Now, what's feeding this fear? They've already seen how difficult it is to ignore or even contain Iran. I mean, you have to keep in mind that Iran is a state that's very big, very populous, so it's basically too big to ignore in the region. And it also has a stake in what's happening in the region. So I'll look quickly at two countries where Iran is involved. One is Iraq, and you know the Gulf states are watching very closely what's happening in in Iraq. And what you're seeing there is a very low level of coordination between the U.S. and Iran in order to fight IS. What's more, what we've seen over the past couple of months is that this fight against IS is only successful when there is that low level of coordination. U.S. airstrikes on IS positions is not enough to drive them back. They've needed Iranian influence and sometimes even position on the ground in order to help them push them back. So the Gulfies have been watching this. In Syria, Iran is a vital player. It's wholeheartedly involved through funding and military assistance. And this, despite a lot of questioning by within the ranks in Iran, but also within the Iranian population that questions Iran's involvement in Syria when they have so many problems at home. So what does that mean? That means that today there's not really any solution to the Syrian crisis without having Iran involved at the negotiating table. But the problem is the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia in particular, refuses to sit at a table with Iran. So the question then becomes, how do you move forward from this point? In my view, the Gulf states actually don't have much to fear from a deal with Iran. Firstly, because for the long-term stability of the region, a nuclear deal is absolutely necessary. More importantly, in order to address their fear about whether a US-Iran friendship would actually marginalize them, well, I think, as I said before, we are so far from a US-Iran relationship, friendship, I mean, hell, we're even far from US-Iran cooperation at this stage. We're only talking very, very low-level coordination, largely because hardliners both in Iran and in the US are just not prepared and not ready to have any kind of formal communication between both countries. So in terms of the possible regional outcomes that have been mentioned following a deal, one that I hear a lot is if we get a nuclear agreement, then we might end up with a proliferation cascade scenario. What does this mean? That means that you have many variables of this particular argument. One is saying that, if Iran has a nuclear deal, it legitimizes its nuclear program, and this will mean that everybody else in the region will go after nuclear programs. The other scenario is, if it legitimizes Iran's nuclear program and Iran eventually cheats or breaks out and goes for the bomb, then everybody else in the region will also do the same. Now, firstly, if everybody else goes for nuclear power, then the first caveat to that is there's nothing worrying about nuclear power. Nuclear power as such, civilian nuclear power is I mean, arguably, I'd say is good, but that's a different debate. But it's not something which everybody should be afraid of. It can be conducted within, the laws that have been put in place and within the non-proliferation regimes. What's more worrisome is if you find yourself in a scenario where ultimately countries in the region will want to pursue the bomb. Again, in my view, and we can go into this a little bit more later if you're actually interested, there are political, economic, security, and major international constraints to any states pursuing this. It's very, very unlikely to happen. The second regional outcome that the states in the region have mentioned is that with a deal, the region fears that Iran will become increasingly hardline because its power and influence in the region would be recognized. I have two counter-arguments to that. Firstly, without a deal, you could say the same thing. If Iran doesn't have an agreement and it's, you're no longer in a position when you're talking to Iran, well, then Iran will also become more hardline, and it has more reason to do exactly what it wants to do in the region. Secondly, a deal will give Iran a certain number of carrots, including economic benefits, and the benefits that go along with opening up towards the West and being reintegrated into the international system, which means that perhaps you'll be able to coax it to act as a more responsible actor in the international arena, much more so than if, in my view, than if there is no agreement. So I think I'll stop there, and then if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much. I think there is a number of connections here that we could explore. I mean, recently the Supreme Leader gave a speech, and while everyone was looking at that speech as and interpreting it in terms of him being negative to the results in Lausanne, I think the more interesting and important aspect of what he said was that, and this goes against what he has publicly said so far, because earlier on he compartmentalized this issue. He said, we will solve this with the Americans, and after that, nothing more. But what he did in that speech was say that if this goes well, and of course he doesn't believe that it will because he doesn't trust the Americans any more than the Americans trust him. If this goes well, we could be open for discussing other issues. And that is, as far as I know, the first time he publicly has stated that there is such a thing, potentially at least, on the horizon. And I think from a perspective of détente in the region, of bringing down the level of confrontation, that is, of course, a potential hope. But of course, if one has a zero-sum game approach, which some of the countries in the region have on this, then by definition, any kind of connection between the US and Iran is to their detriment. And that's probably one of the things that is the art of diplomacy trying to overcome, that they can be winners at the same time, if you will. But that also brings us to the whole discussion that Peter, among others, mentioned, the idea of continuity. That is the fact that there is continuity both in the sense of what was before the Islamic Republic and what the Islamic Republic is internally, but also how it is viewed from the outside. That for many of these countries, it perhaps isn't that much of a difference, whether it's a monarchy or an Islamic Republic. Their problem is the geopolitical weight of whoever is in charge of Tehran. And that is one of the things. If there's anyone who wants to chip in, yes.
Well, it's quite legitimate for the countries or the region to not to be looking forward to a time when there will be Iranian hegemony. But not accepting Iranian hegemony doesn't mean that you can envisage Iranian exclusion and isolation. Between those two, there is politics and there is diplomacy. But if you're so afraid of somebody else being overwhelmingly strong, because you're quite aware of your own weakness. It is not military. The Saudis don't lack weapons, advanced weapons, and they have an ally that's called the United States of America. So militarily, let's be serious. They feel weak politically because those states are not based upon societies and political structures. And, it's enough to read Arab Human Development Report, UNDP, 2002 and following years, and you see all the reasons for weaknesses. Weak governance, lack of rule of law. Compared to that, Iran is not a democracy, but it's a modern state, a state with a functioning state. Of course, if you're not a functioning state, any state will look terrifying to you. So the problem is that they should be strong inside in order to have a normal, sometimes adversarial, sometimes cooperative relationship with Iran. But this is not the case, which makes me think that the situation will not improve soon. To have, and the worst thing is, in order to prevent not Iranian hegemony, but Iranian inclusion and preventing Iran from playing its role in the region, they use every means available. I mean, jihadism is supported by somebody, isn't it? But if you use that, then chickens will come home to roost, and the Saudis are already worried that those guys eventually will knock at their door.
Now, just kind of remind, it's interesting which I think we have all touched upon, is this: will the relationship develop between the U.S. and Iran, and what kind of cooperation will there be? We should remind that Iran and the U.S. had very close cooperation in Afghanistan 2001-2002, and it worked out very nicely. And it was the now Iranian foreign minister who, at a big conference in Bonn, I was there as a Swedish ambassador to Afghanistan, made the trick. So there are experiences. There was also willingness to discuss stabilization in Iraq after the U.S. invasion. I think this is also one of the dilemmas which I tried to point at, is that at the same time there's a fear of what is locally labeled as a cultural invasion. That it's not necessarily stabilizing a region where many of the actors, the regional, including Europe and the U.S., do have very similar interests when it comes to stabilizing Iraq, stabilizing Syria in particular, the whole issue about Islamic State and things like that. But in the Iranian context, you are then very close to something which they don't want, is cultural invasion, because that would probably have, or could very easily have an appeal on those 70% which I referred to before, who are not necessarily a part of the making of the revolution, who have other interests. And there, just one thing that I should have mentioned, but which I didn't, is that in this young generation, when you look at your academic colleagues in Iran, 60% of students are female, are women, but only 20% of them get a job afterwards. Again, as a very sort of conservative society, for me, cultural invasion has all these dimensions, which will be very interesting to follow if there is a deal. Which will be the next step that the government and the regime can take, and where will the serious political impediments really show? Because that would then address internal, still unresolved issues in the Islamic Republic, where I'm increasingly reaching a point of view that the big issue in the Islamic Republic is the role of women. It's not addressed, and neither Sweden 1979 is the same as Sweden 2015, and Iran 1979 is very different from what we experienced, those of us who live there. So it's, again, how do you sort of get what you may need from the security side without getting the other things that you don't want?
Well, I mean, that kind of compartmentalization only happens on paper, very seldom in reality. And I think that shows the generational gap. The people who made the revolution are obviously also reinterpreting what they did, but they're doing it in very different ways. If you look at the conservatives and the hardliners, their reinterpretation is very different from the one from the reformists. And for those who were not there at all, obviously their interpretations are by definition almost in a parallel universe. Ariane?
Yeah, I'll make 2 points. One, to go back and echo everything that's been said about Saudi. I think that, you know, if you given the choice, Saudi Arabia would rather choose a nuclear-armed Iran that is isolated, that is not doing well, and that is excluded from both regional and international affairs, than a non-nuclear armed Iran that is doing well and that is integrated into both regional and international processes, and of which the status is normalized essentially. And that's something that I think Saudi officials say in private, but that they would obviously never say in public, right? The second thing I wanna echo is Rouzbeh's point about the Supreme Leader, and I think that's something that is extremely important, and in the U.S. Especially, but I think to some degree in Europe as well. People tend to read everything he says literally. They take everything he says exactly, literally. They don't read between the lines. And a lot of times, if you look at what he says and the reality and the policy aspects, they're very different. So for instance, just to give you an example on the nuclear issue, going back to the quantifiable, the number of centrifuges. Last summer, for those of you who've been following the issue closely, you may remember that the Supreme Leader came out and put a number on separative work units, essentially how many centrifuges should Iran have. And it was a big number. It was 190,000 SWU, separative work units. Everyone in Washington was freaking out. Everybody was saying, that said, Iran is not going to scale back its enrichment program. There's not going to be a deal. That's the end of it. Of course, if you look at the reality of what's going on in Iran and what Iran can technically do, Iran is very far from the 190,000 SWU. So all you have to do is sort of read the next line to see that what he was saying was, we may not need this in the next 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, but eventually we will need this number. But of course, everybody stopped at the number, and that was the end of it. What was happening with what Rouzbeh was saying with the recent speech is that in the US, and this is touching upon the US itself, no one was paying attention to, oh, we would potentially consider, normalizing relations with the US or cooperating with the United States. We're using this as testing, the negotiations as a test. Everybody was focusing on, the Supreme Leader said there should not be any, termination of sanctions and phasing. It should all happen overnight. And that's something that everybody's been going on and saying that's it. That's the end of the negotiations. So for months and months, it's been the end of the negotiations, and Iran has not, crossed a single red line. And yet we've seen that there's been extension after extension and agreements eventually. and that none of those things have been set in stone.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a point about saying that you have to be fair also to the Arab states in the Gulf. The Iranians themselves haven't helped their case and have really fed this fear that a lot of the Gulf Arab states have. You just have to look at their past rhetoric. For example, a lot of what they said about the Arab Spring and calling it an Islamic wave and wanting it to be the liberation of the region. I mean, all of this made the Gulf Arab states very nervous. Their involvement in Syria, which has now effectively become a proxy war, a fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran largely. A lot of their policies, which have been, in my view, sectarian, but not always intentionally sectarian. More often than not, actually unintentionally sectarian, in the sense that they will support, for example, Shia groups, largely because Shia groups will come to them for help. And so this feeds into Saudi Arabia's sectarian divide theory and, pitting the Shias and the Sunnis against one another. The only thing is that today, this new Iranian administration has really displayed a willingness to talk to the other side. But I think it might be a little bit too little and too late.
Yes, and of course, both in Saudi Arabia and Iran, we're also talking about different power centers who make very different interpretations on what the other side is doing and what they want to achieve with what they're doing themselves. So there's if you will, this is partly an echo chamber of very many different voices. So when we say Tehran or we say Riyadh, we're really using a shorthand that doesn't make the issue necessarily that much justice. I think we should start letting the audience come in to get into the game. So let's have some questions if anyone has anything they want to ask the panelists. Please.
My name is Ibrahim Afza. I teach international law in Copenhagen. And my question was more, I mean, it's to all of you, but it refers to what the Ambassador Toscano said, the structural advantages that Iran has as a big nation, as a relatively stable society, as a modern economy, a modern society. And this compares extremely unfavorably to the Arab societies, all of which are in a very, very profound crisis and have been for decades. There's this article by an Emirati journalist in an American journal where he described Arab society as the end of Arab civilization, the complete collapse of it. And I think this is not completely overdriven. And against that background, what some of you, both of you, described the interest of the Arab states, those that are still semi-stable, to prevent a reintegration of Iran into that economy, almost at any cost. That does not bode very well for a constructive engagement. And the question is what you think about that somewhat pessimistic reading of their future.
Thank you. Who wants to start? Dina?
I can start and then pass it on. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I am beyond pessimistic about it. I think it's a shame because much like the Iranian and American interactions in the last little while and willingness to talk to one another, which has never quite matched up until recently where you've had the latest round of the nuclear negotiations. I think almost the same can be said between the Gulf states and Iran. It's always one side that wants it more than the other, and I would argue that more often than not, particularly at the moment, it's the Iranian side that wants it, and the other side that's absolutely shut off to the idea. Iran has made a number of steps towards the Gulf Arab states in order to at least set up a dialogue. Now, some would say some of these efforts have been a little bit half-hearted, but I think it's fair to say that under the Rouhani administration, Zarif is very aware of the need to at least have dialogue with the Gulf Arab states. So he is trying. But I think that sadly, like I said, it's too little too late, and we've come to a point where on the other side, there's just absolutely no willingness to talk, none at all. And I think this stems from this fear of a nuclear agreement and an acceptance of Iran as a regional power. So I don't see it working out anytime soon. Having said that, I know that, you know, as part of what we do as a group, but also individually in with our various organizations, I mean, we try to facilitate dialogue. We try to bring Iranians and Arabs together in various fora. So we'll keep trying. I just don't see it going anywhere concretely anytime soon.
No, I totally agree.
Well, I mean, I think somewhat optimistically at least. I mean, we have to say that what did in the end work in the Iranian-American interaction is, first of all, that in the negotiation process, they gave up on the most unrealistic preconditions on the other side. So they let that go. And secondly, that they agreed, if you will, on inverting the whole idea of a zero-sum game. That is that they can both win something. They will not win everything, but they can win something. And so therefore, it would be worthwhile trying. I think that's what's, if you will, the mentality of that is missing a bit in the interaction on both sides when it comes to Iran and the Gulf states, is that, you know, we can both come out of this as winners one way or another. It doesn't have to be that it's on at each other's expense. Peter.
Sorry, just to add, one is, of course, the reality that Iran purchased a historic state, which we must remember. There are a few historic states in the region. Iran is one of them, Egypt is one of them, and interestingly, Syria is one of them. So just remind, this is of course the reality that we already referred to. This is a big country in the region. It has advanced. You know, science, not only a nuclear one, but in the region, and it has a comparatively well-educated population. So that's a reality. Also, just remind that the Regional Gulf Cooperation Council was created as a result of the Islamic Revolution. Just to remind about the mindset that already then, when this happened, perhaps in those days the Iranian policy was more aggressive. The idea of exporting the revolution was I think, a reality. But still, for me, it also it very much recalls the whole mindset where you have a number of major countries in the region for different reasons. Egypt is not relevant for the time being. Iraq is not relevant for the time being. And the third one, Iran, is relevant. And of course, I think one has to factor in, and just to agree that those of us who live in Tehran, I think we are rather concerned about the total lack, regardless of which side has tried more and less, but I agree with your picture, the lack of any serious dialogue between the two important countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And at the same time, which I think we should also remind, the fact that Iran and the US, as it were, they have been in constant dialogue for 2 years. And what happens, we can just see it, live on CNN, the fact that you have these official meetings between Secretary Kerry and the Foreign Minister Zarif. That's all right, but I think what is forgotten, will come back, and we will see that on different levels, the whole nuclear negotiation has also been an interaction between U.S. administration and capabilities and science and the Iranian one, which was, as you also said before, unheard of 2 years ago. What will be the impact? I think one should also remind that even if the U.S. is seen as the great Satan, historically I would argue this is not right. There are other countries who have. And up to 1953, it wasn't at all like that. But it's still, we shall also remember that there is no animosity against America. There's animosity against the, Washington D.C. with all due respect for those who live there. But there is still a as it is also towards Europe, there's a curiosity and also I would argue some sort of admiration, being the scientific progress, also the political progress, which during the last 2 years, which then more or less coincide with my presence there, has, I'm quite convinced, again, influenced those 70%. If you have to uphold the picture of the enemy, which you can argue may be necessary for the regime, I think it will be increasingly difficult, because you have been able to sit down, not only negotiating, but the interesting thing for us, you have been able to do without major leaks. The fact that you have been able to address very difficult issues, and all sides, and in particular, much of the technological or technical discussions are between the Iranians and the Americans, that this happened without major leaks. And it's interesting when you look at, not at this sort of colleagues who are here, but how many times media have been totally wrong on the subject because they didn't have access to hard information. For me, isn't that sort of also, you create some sort of trust among those who have been negotiating, which is a sort of still limited group, but of course you have been able to progress on a difficult issue because some trust has been built. And then you have the political realities for those who are not a part of the process, where you have to sell this vacuum cleaner. There you have another society, both in the US and in Iran. So something has happened during the last 2 years.
Yes, that reminds me of the Italian diplomat Gian Domenico Picco, who once pointed out that countries do not negotiate, persons negotiate. So when you're sitting in the negotiation room, it's actually the interaction and the psychology between the people there, rather than as just abstract representatives of states. So that is an important aspect of that. More questions? Yes.
Don't you think that the motivation of Iran's government for pursuing nuclear program is more of a matter of national security, and as long as they have less than what Israel has, they're not going to stop?
Can I have a try? Although somebody else is talking about the nuclear. You know, first of all, I've always thought that the nuclear issue was instrumental for both sides. It was not the main purpose. For Iran, it was definitely a way of being accepted as a counterpart. I mean, and it succeeded, didn't it? Without the nuclear issue, the Americans wouldn't be sitting across the table with the Iranians. That's already a huge political result, apart from the weapons. Second, I think they want to be in the situation that Japan is. They have a peaceful nuclear energy, but if one day it's necessary, of course, it's called threshold, you know. But incidentally, I wanted to make a short comment, which sounds a little bit too technical, on the breakout time. The breakout, as was said, is the time needed to have enough highly enriched uranium to build a bomb. But in order to have an operational warhead, you need 4 years. So, I mean, we can relax a little longer. We can do a lot of things in 4 years. And then I think there is this thing of national pride, though. You know, I was really struck when I was in Tehran. I was talking with people who are nostalgic about the monarchy. There's still some around, you know. And those, whereas the regime people said, no, we don't want a nuclear weapon. Allah doesn't want it, believe it or not. The monarchy said, yes, we need a weapon because we're a great country, 3,000 years civilization. So you see, it's not a regime thing. It's a national pride. So that's another component.
Ariane?
Yeah, I'll echo all of that and say that, first of all, the national pride component is actually going back to the continuity. It's something that you find in the monarchy's narrative as much as you find in the Islamic Republic's narrative. I mean, essentially, the nuclear narrative, if you look at it, it's exactly identical between the Islamic Republic and the Shah. The only difference is that the Islamic Republic introduced the fatwa. And that's the only difference between the two. You look at it, the national pride, we have to be self-sufficient, we need to make scientific and technological progress, all of it is identical. The second thing is also echoing what was said about, Iran doesn't need to sit on however many nuclear warheads Israel has. I think that again, under the Shah, afterwards, under the Islamic Republic, Iran was pursuing, hedging. It wanted to have the ability to have nuclear weapons if it wanted to. But I mean, you don't need to have actual warheads to be able to deter other countries. Nuclear deterrence doesn't necessarily come with warheads. It comes with the knowledge that you can get them if you need them to. And I think that that's the policy Iran has been pursuing, rather than we want to have exactly what Israel has.
Can I just add?
Yeah, sure.
Very, very quickly, to add to that, I mean, if it really was for national security purposes, I think Iran would have had a crash program towards a nuclear weapon. If what they really wanted was the bomb, they would have gone for it. That's not to say it would have happened tomorrow, but it would have happened a hell of a lot faster than it's going now. It really is, I think, more a policy of hedging and just kind of testing the waters and seeing how far you can go until you get into trouble.
You could say, I mean, to some degree, that the Iranian program, no matter what its intention has been, and of course that changes over time to some degree, looks very much like the Israeli nuclear program once upon a time. And the idea of ambivalence and of hedging, not really saying where you want to go with it, but making sure that everyone knows that there is something, a potential, if you will.
Can I just add one thing, and that is the issue about pride. You say security. I think perhaps I think what is interesting for us who work there and live there and who have lived there is that you have the pride on one side and the need we have to be treated with dignity, and that is something where we as foreigners it has a historic cultural background and things like that. When you hear it repeated, you sometimes get a little tired of it, to be very honest. But we have to realize this is a reality. In order to sit down and in order to negotiate, and that's where I come back to, I think, when the negotiating side could agree on not leaks, that was something that appealed to the sense of dignity of the Iranians. And it's very difficult really to define it, but you have the pride issue on one side, we can do it. Whether or not the Iranians had a program after 2003, history will tell us sooner or later, or if it's a South African thing that they had and then they discontinued, historians will tell us. But for us, I think working there, this is where we as outsider, I would not argue seriously when it comes to my own country about you have to treat us with dignity. But we have to understand that for others who have been isolated and things like that, this is a real issue, and it's not, again, a regime issue. This is something which normal Iranians repeat. When you see them private, they may not like the regime and things like that. That's the issue about dignity, which we have to then digest and say, how do we do it? We are not normally very good at those things.
Just a short comment. I think that for the Iranians, the necessary soundtrack for the negotiations was, that beautiful song by Aretha Franklin. It's called Respect. That's essential for the Iranians.
And when it comes to the status of having nuclear weapons or being in a state where you could have them, I think we also have to remember that that's not particular to Iran. I think we can all agree, probably those of us who follow these kind of issues, that the country in Europe that's going to give up its nuclear weapons last is going to be France.
Hello. Thank you very much to the panel. I think in many ways you could say that the Islamic Republic as a political project has been quite a success, in the sense that it has, despite being born in the turmoil of revolution and having gone through sanctions and 8 years of war with Iraq and the militarization of the region and all these obstacles, the Islamic Republic has on many issues been quite successful. It has managed to build up a corporatist welfare state, unlike most other countries in the region. The spread of higher education, the integration of the periphery into the national economy, the establishment of some kind of participatory electoral politics, and in many ways you could say that in that sense this very unlikely political project has been quite a success. So I'm thinking if there is now a détente, a rapprochement, or whatever you would call it, and Iran is reintegrated into the world economy, and the relations are more or less normalized with the West, how does that bode for the democratic opposition in Iran and for the reformist movement? Will this situation in fact strengthen the oligarchy, if we want to call it that, and lessen the opportunities for pro-democratic movements to create a rift and to unsettle the Islamic Republic?
This is a very, very interesting question, because one can go back even to the 2009, the Green Movement and everything, and look at why it failed. The repression was there, of course, but there is something else there. I think the Iranian opposition was able to coalesce, not the opposition, the protest in 2009. Where is my vote? But there is much more than the vote. And if you have a sociological analysis of who was mainly on the street, it was middle class. I mean, the lower, the less privileged, the less educated, were standing on the sidelines, basically. So democracy in Iran will have a chance if it will address the inequality, the privilege, because this is something that's felt so much. And it explains why in 2005 Ahmadinejad was really elected. There is a lot of resentment in Iran against elites, clerical elite, power elite, but also elite of intellectuals who aspire to be the next ruling class, because they say they're all the same, they're all privileged. So I think, yes, there is a chance for democracy in Iran, but democracy in Iran will have to be social, not socialist, but social. Also because of what you said, because the regime now is a strange mix of state role, capitalism, crony capitalism, but also a component of welfare, which is badly organized by the existing state welfare and Islamic charity. Those things, if you come in with a neoliberal formula, forget it. They will call back some form of dictatorship. So it's going to be a very difficult process, possible, but very difficult.
I mean, you could also say that one of the weaknesses of the reformist movement in general has been that it's been big on political liberalism, but it hasn't been very clear on what kind of economic policy it wants to pursue. It's been very much the same kind of general economic liberalism that does not address the fact that Iran today is much more of a class society than it ever was in the 1970s, for instance. So those cleavages have actually grown, and someone needs to address them.
Yeah, can I add my 2 cents?
Yes.
I'm not actually sure that I agree with the point that was made about 2009. I mean, yeah, maybe it was predominantly a sort of middle class thing, but I think there were different parts of society that were involved. I certainly remember seeing people who were from very different backgrounds on the street then. What I will say to your question, though, is that I think the nuclear issue has. Let's put it this way. If the nuclear issue goes away, I think there will be some more room for civil society to breathe. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the next 3-4 months following the deal, but I think that once things start to sort of normalize and pick back up, then people will have a bit more room to breathe and make demands that they haven't been able to make in the past few years. There's been a lot of self-censorship because of the nuclear issue. And I think that once that is gone, and once the whole threat of military intervention by the US, by Israel, is sort of put aside for a bit, people will be empowered a little bit to sort of go back to some of the things they wanted in 2009. If you remember in 2009, during the campaign, the discussions, campaign discussions were very much focused on human rights, on civil society, on a variety of issues. But in 2013, it was a completely different atmosphere. People were not really talking about human rights and civil society and so on anymore. They were talking mainly about the economic issue and the nuclear issue. So I think that once that is gone or put aside for a bit, then that they will have room to go back to some of those issues.
No, continue the same track. I think one is, of course, one should perhaps also remember that the revolution at the beginning wasn't an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution which took place against the Shah. And then what happened and how was, use the word hijack is too much, but where it ended up where it was. But it was a revolution that I would argue that had a very strong popular sentiment. But I think your question is the one I would love to answer. I would then write the book and I start working. Because you have a few things. One is, of course, when will the, as you were alluding to, I spoke about the role of women. The whole issue about human rights cannot be just forgotten. It is a society where human rights are violated against in a way which in my way is just cannot continue if we want to develop the society. You have the whole role of media. It's interesting, you know, every time you leave Iran you realize how different it is, and you come here and you open your iPad and you can read Twitter. Come on, this is and you can read WordPress and things like that. The whole issue about the role of media will be one that will come back, and be it and you have closures of newspapers today. You had a recent closure of one of the female magazines and things like that. So for me, this is will the question if the issue about the sanctions is settled, the economy will have a chance to improve. I would then argue some of the other issues will come back, and how the government would treat it and deal with it, because then you come back, then you open lots of issues which I'm not so sure is being addressed at the time being, and the reaction which we all read about when Zarif in the US says we don't lock up people for their opinions. That for me is very interesting. The reaction also in Iran is because this is, again, there are lots of issues which you have been able to put aside, and what you also said, the 2013 elections again created these expectations. Give them a chance to solve the nuclear issue. It has been a long period where people are supporting, still complaining about things happening, but we have to address the nuclear issue first. And as I said, then, however, the sanctions relief will not be a panacea for all other issues, and then they will come back. They had done progress on literacy, which is remarkable, but that creates another problem: literate people, and literate people do think differently than people are not literate. So for me, it's I wish, or you academics could have the answer for us practitioners.
Well, I mean, if I may add my 2 cents to that, I think perhaps sometimes we also stare ourselves a bit too blind on the whole idea of the labels, whether it's human rights or something else. I mean, a lot of the problems are on a more everyday level about good governance, or rather the lack of good governance. It's about the practices of how you run a state and how you manage things. Now, you can say all of that flows into a general label of human rights, but I think sometimes when people put that label on it, it makes it more difficult to solve the problems, rather than if you actually look at the kind of the technical level of how bureaucracies work, or rather don't work. Okay. Yeah.
Just one thing. What would be the ideal solution, the ideal future, the ideal scenario for, let's say, regime conservatives? China, normalizing relation with the West, thriving economy, and the regime maintained. Unfortunately for them, the Iranians are not Chinese. I don't think they can pull it off.
I was going to say something similar, actually, but my conclusion was going to be very different. I was going to say that
Iranians are Chinese.
No, not that they're Chinese, but that many people in Iran want change, but nobody wants, well, very few want drastic change. More people want change within the regime. And so actually I would argue that if they come to a nuclear agreement and take that initial kind of wall out of the way, then it paves the way for slow change within the regime, which would actually keep the regime in place, but address a lot of the concerns that some of the Iranian population has. Now, whether we like that or not, that's a different issue. But I think that actually it wouldn't be, a nuclear deal wouldn't be a barrier to that. It would help.
No, I absolutely agree with what you are saying, and I think we also live in a pipe dream if we say that Iranians would like a liberal Western society. This is not true. There are lots of things that you have well-educated normal Iranians who are not really say, well, this is not really what we want. So it's still for me. Come back to your question. Is it when you're trying to find out what kind of modern society, given the parameters that you have in Iran, that has to be sorted out internally. It will not be Sweden. It will not be Germany or whatever. It will be something else. But again, I think the debate has to be in Iran by Iranians, and given some of the limitations that you have on the public discourse, it doesn't take place now, but it will have to take place in order to address what kind of society you would like to have.
You and then Lars, please.
Well, you said something about Swedish fascination with punctuality, and another thing that people very much like here is the gender dimension of things. And my question is, do you see any gender dimension to Iran's nuclear behavior, nuclear negotiations, and if so, how it is, how gender, the category gender, is affecting Iran's nuclear foreign policy? Thanks.
You should take this question.
No, Who wants to try and explore this?
Amateur law.
I think the gender dimension of the nuclear issue is either understudied or non-existent.
Or both.
Or both. Or both. Sorry. Lars?
Hi. To bring it home a little bit, and I'm going to ask a very open question here. What relevance does this have for Sweden? What's the importance for these issues? And so that kind of limits it to two people, but looking forward to hearing about that.
You're both employed by the Swedish state, but you more than me.
I wouldn't say that, what was the role for Sweden, I think, like that. I think we will have to take a look at slightly broader what will be the impact in Europe and the European impact. Sweden has a very, very good standing. It's great to be represent Sweden. There's also perhaps an image of our own country and the fellow Nordics, which is not totally true. The impact will be, I think the general opening, if there is one, will just benefit. So it will be able to address issues which cannot be addressed for the time being. You have regional issues. We have mentioned a few of them. I think that's the impact. In Iran, you hear very often that if there's a deal, economy will blossom and it will be great for Europe and things like that. Yeah, perhaps in the longer run. But for me, it's again what I think we have been speaking about. Is it would be a change of the whole atmosphere. You will be able to address issues where you still have, you just cannot, because it's either you put it in a sectarian framework, you put it in a regional framework, you put it in a Persian Arab framework and things like that. The moment you can get away from the stereotypes, then you can address it, and that is good for Sweden. But you cannot say will have a direct, I would argue, impact on Sweden, but it will have a direct impact on the broader sort of European-Iranian relationship, which is good enough. Don't forget, Sweden is a part of the European Union.
Yes, and on that note, if I may chip in, European Union, I think, and for Sweden, but especially for the European Union as a whole, Iran is a neighbor of our neighbors. And what Iran does or doesn't do, and what Iran is involved in or not involved in, I think impacts the European Union much more than people have up until recently been willing to accept. partly because the nuclear issue has kind of made it into a conventional wisdom that we should ignore or isolate Iran. Not perhaps willing to accept the fact that even if we isolate Iran, doesn't mean that what they do or don't do doesn't impact us. Because that kind of compartmentalization doesn't exist in the modern world. So you can't get away from that. With regards to Sweden and Iran, I think, Sweden and Iran has had a fluctuating relationship that goes back more than a century. And I think if things go in the direction of a nuclear deal and a détente, I think perhaps we will be climbing out of a valley in that fluctuating relationship and hopefully hit an all-time high. Final question.
Thank you. Mr. Peter Taylor, yes? You told that Iran has a very complex government. I would like to tell no, it's not very complex, just it's not compatible with political definition in West. They have the other definition, if we know about that. Okay, my question is related to after negotiation. Is it possible to take sanction after the Lausanne? Okay, because if it is possible, actually it helps to democracy in Iran. If, for example, if it wanted to continue for 20 years, we want to know what's happening in Iran. And from the other side, the Riyadh, and the one side, the Republic Party in the United States and Israel wanted to force the Obama government to have visit and control on fortress and martial parts in Iran. It has the other subject from the nuclear parts. I don't know why. Maybe, for example, Riyadh thinks about the Persian Gulf or and Iranian hegemony, or the Israel or the Republic parties in United States worry about Israel. But the martial parts in Iran is different from the nuclear parts, and we must be considered this section. Thank you.
Well, my simple comment would be I'm happy that I'm the ambassador of Sweden in Iran and not of any other country. I think the impact of what the US want and what Israel want, I think that's you can speculate on that, and I don't find that, frankly, I don't find that very productive. Excuse me, because I think what is interesting when you are there, I would say there's also a change in the public debate in Iran taking place, and that has changed quite considerably during the last year and a half. Much of the rhetoric that you referred to during your time is actually gone. It still exists, but it's not a part of the of the public debate. In the same time, you still have conservatives who would use that kind of argument, because for me it's still and I still argue the power. It is a very complex country with lots of layers and power centers and things like that, but it's still there's a lack of also understanding, I think, of general public in all these countries, because of course you can say, which is not light when you say that I would argue that Israel and Iran have a lot of similar interests in the region, but for different reasons they cannot address it. So I rather strike this positive note that Rusbe did. If they will be the sort of the peak of relations, I don't know, but there is a possibility if there's a deal to address other issues. Don't forget that is also, you know, official EU policy. You have the Middle East as an area of free of weapons of mass destruction and things like that. Then you can start addressing issues, and of course that will be if that will be successful or not, I just don't know. But it's still the difference and the change in the atmosphere, I think, is really remarkable, and then you can address perhaps also stereotypes that each side has of each other, and which isn't really sort of beneficial when you start, if you want to start address in a more practical way, and you know, the differences and the problems. Then I think what the Americans really want, what the Israelis want, I think like that. One is the public rhetoric, and then again, just to repeat what I said, if there is agreement to address serious issues and you agree not to leak, then you can make progress.
Berto?
There is something I think you will find interesting. In 2003, the Iranians tried to send to the Americans a proposal for what the French would call a ballon d'essai. They were just a feeler. But let me read the Middle East part, because it's interesting. It says, Iran accepts a dialogue in mutual respect, by the way, and agrees that the US puts the following aims on the agenda. So, willing to discuss the following. 1. Stop of any material support to Palestinian opposition groups, Hamas, Jihad, etc., from Iranian territory. Pressure on these organizations to stop violent actions against civilians within borders of 67, because on the other side it's resistance, of course. 2. Action on Hezbollah to become a mere political organization within Lebanon. 3. Acceptance of the Arab League Beirut Declaration, Saudi Initiative, two-states approach. Now, Iran, under Khatami, was willing to discuss this. I think it might become, again, willing, and maybe it is already willing to discuss some sort of these general proposals.
Ariane?
Yeah, just to go back to what's going on in the U.S., I think that it would be a mistake to oversimplify what's happening there. You know, there are a lot of different factors that are pushing and pulling in all sorts of directions. There, you know, including domestic politics. Domestic politics in the U.S. is extremely polarized right now, and it's becoming increasingly polarized. So that's one factor. I mean, a lot of what the GOP, the Republican Party, does is not necessarily dictated by Israel. It's dictated by a lot of people, frankly, really disliking Obama and his policies. And to some extent, I think the nuclear issue has become a battleground between the two sides. There is, of course, the Israel factor on some level, but there's also the GCC factor. You know, the Saudis have been lobbying more than Israel in Washington to try to derail the negotiations. So there is also that factor. There's also personalities and personal, you know, in Congress, there are folks who legitimately distrust Iran. There are folks who want zero enrichment and think that anything above zero enrichment is a concession to Iran. There are also those who just believe that there should not be any sort of normalization with Iran for various reasons. The hostage crisis is still in the back of certain people's minds. So there are a number of very complex factors that come into play, and I think that just, you know, limiting it down to Israel, because that's sort of the most visible, I guess, component of what's going on, would oversimplify it and would, as the ambassador was saying, not be very productive.
Okay, and on that note of complexity and nuance, I think... And productivity, obviously. I'd like to thank the panelists and the audience for a very interesting conversation, and have a nice evening.